office hours. This is the fifth of 6 installments. My name is William Walker, and want to thank you all for joining us. Got my team that I've had for the past few weeks, and introduce them shortly. Please be sure to let us know if you have any problems hearing us. Hopefully you're hearing us well right now. We'll get started shortly. Thank you for joining us. A production of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. So yeah, thank you. Welcome. We're just about a minute after 10 o'clock. This is the Office of Planning Research, SB 743 Implementation Office Hours Series. This is open office hours for the 5th of 6 installments. I will introduce you to the team very shortly, and we'll have a brief slide presentation followed by some Q&A. For folks who are new to the Zoom universe, down at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A section. We have disabled chat, but the Q&A is available. You're welcome to go into the Q&A section and ask your questions that you might have about implementing SB 743 in your particular jurisdiction. We will be happy to have those questions answered by our wonderful team. Give it a couple more minutes for folks to join us. Let's see that we have about 50 participants right now. I want to thank all of you for joining us right now. We are at about 3 minutes after, so I'd like to take this time to welcome everyone to our open office hours for the week of June 15th. Today is Wednesday, June 17th. My name is William Walker. I'm an associate planner with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. I'm joined by Chris Ganson, who is our Senior Advisor for Transportation, Jeannie Lee, our Chief Counsel, Natalie Cuffel, our Land Use Counsel, and Alyssa Montanez, our Special Assistant. Before we begin the webinar, I want to take some time to acknowledge the grief and stress that so many people are experiencing right now following the recent violent deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Monica Diamond, Tony McDade, and other Black Americans. These deaths and the unrest that have followed come as Californians continue to grapple with the devastating deaths and health impacts caused by COVID-19, as well as economic impacts associated with the pandemic. Impacts which, like violent death, Black Americans and Black Californians experience at far higher rates than other groups due to longstanding structural and institutional racism, which we must continue to expand our efforts to address and eradicate. We acknowledge the disproportionate pain and burden Black Californians bear and urge all of us to work together every day for an equitable and just society. So thank you for giving me that moment at the beginning of our webinar. We come to you socially distanced or physically distanced, whichever term you prefer, as we have for the past 5 weeks. as the state continues to open up, we're still aware of the issues around COVID-19, and we hope that you continue to be safe, whether you are able to shelter in place or if you're at risk and having to be out in the world. We're definitely thinking of you. And again, we thank you for joining us and taking some time out of these crazy times to get some information about how we can implement Senate Bill 743. I would like to introduce Chris Ganson, our Senior Advisor for Transportation. He will be taking us through the beginning of our presentation this morning. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning, William. Thanks so much for the introduction. Just want to echo William's hope that everyone out there is doing well in these continued challenging times. And we'll jump right in on talking about SB 743 today. We're generally going to have open office hours, and you can start whenever you want, typing questions into the question and answer box on Zoom. And I'm going to actually start off answering a few questions that we got during webinars and emailed questions in the past, focused on the continued use of LOS, or I should say, what role LOS has in an SB 743 world. Let me get my slides functioning here. And there we go. So I'm just going to walk through a few of these questions again, then we'll open it up to open questions on any of this stuff or anything else that any of you have to bring today. I also have a few additional questions separate from LOS. I think just a couple actually that were emailed to us that I'm going to answer at the top. But we'll have the majority of the time, the majority of the 2 hours will be for answering your questions that you bring up during the webinar. And again, in the Q&A feature of Zoom, please. So, so just to go through briefly, most are pretty familiar with this at this point, I think, but what's LOS's role after July 1st? Well, we can't be used in CEQA, and a lead agency is legally and technically allowed to continue using LOS outside of CEQA, although it's generally not recommended to do so by LOS, by OPR, sorry. But there are some jurisdictions, we want to make a little bit of a distinction here. There are some jurisdictions that have continued to use LOS or LOS-like metrics, but in a vastly different way than they were being used under CEQA. To describe this, say take a project, a hypothetical project the size of a city block. Before that project, in order to be sure it was analyzing LOS over the full extent of potential impact and be safe from a challenger coming and saying, no, you should have looked at more intersections under CEQA, that project would have had to analyze frequently around 100 intersections. There's a lot of time and expense in doing so, and not a lot of utility in doing so, if any. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So that was what analysis looked like for LOS pre-743. The jurisdictions which have retained LOS that I'm familiar with have done it in a much more targeted fashion to look simply at the intersections immediately around the project, and maybe in some cases a block away. So that looks more like 4, 8, maybe 10, 12 at the most intersections, rather than 100. Of course, that means a cost savings of down to a cost of 5 to 10% for analysis, because the costs roughly scale with the number of intersections you're needing to analyze. So vastly reduced costs in effect, and we don't have significant concerns with that kind of approach. So we don't think it's important whether you use LOS or another metric, so long as when you assess a project, you are using that informationally, balanced with other facts about the project and about its impacts. I'll talk about this a little bit later as well. Rather than just as a knee-jerk LOS crossed a certain threshold, and therefore it should be corrected above all other interests, right? When you are considering a street improvement in response to an LOS impact, for example, it would also be important to consider the walkability of that intersection, right? Which LOS could and often does act against. So balancing those interests. Also, if you're going to be laying down additional pavement to accommodate car travel, thinking of the effects across environmental effects, pavement maintenance costs, again, pedestrian crossing distances, keep the full array of your citizens' interests in mind. Again, OPR does recommend ending LOS mitigation requirements for individual projects, and that recommendation is contained in our general plan guidelines. What we recommend using is, we're awfully used to in California and really across the country, using LOS as a proxy for success in transportation. And I'm going to bring up some more recent research on that in a few slides. But what we really care about in transportation is getting people to places, getting them through intersections in automobiles quickly. May sometimes be a proxy for that, but actually, as we'll see, the research shows it often and most generally isn't a proxy for that. It actually works the wrong way. So what we recommend using, and again, this is from the general plan guidelines, you can see it on page 78, is using metrics of connectivity, accessibility, access to destinations instead. Those are all interchangeable words for metrics that capture how quickly and easily people can get to destinations. Examples of these metrics are how many jobs are accessible within 30 minutes, how many hospitals are accessible within 45 minutes, how many are grocery stores available within a certain amount of time. So metrics of accessibility account for not just mobility, not just how well a car can get down, how quickly a car can move down a street or through an intersection, but account for how far you need to go. So you can solve your transportation problems in many cases from an accessibility or access to destinations or connectivity point of view with land use. So to take a little bit deeper dive into the general plan guidelines, again, where metrics of level of service are still used, we've covered this a little bit already, but use them as planning metrics rather than project assessment metrics is our recommendation. And again, they should be balanced with other metrics. Look holistically at what you want to see for your city and what you need to do to protect your citizen, what you need to do to keep them safe and keep the environment preserved, and keep your budget intact, thinking of maintenance obligations going forward, and consider all of those factors rather than just one in LOS. Okay, so you can dig into this general plan guidelines language. It's on page 78 if you're interested. I mentioned that I would share some of the more recent research. We have a bunch of it up on our website. I actually just checked, and I'm going to apologize. I haven't had a chance to correct it, but there are a couple broken links. We'll try and get those fixed in the next week to research. The issue is that, or a key issue is that first, LOS mitigation has been shown itself to cause environmental impacts, including, of course, when you accommodate the car first and foremost and make it, give it priority over other modes, as you must do oftentimes to improve LOS. That increases VMT, increases auto travel, which leads to increases also in greenhouse gases, worsening air quality, more noise, energy use, other impacts that need to be considered in CEQA. So if you're going to require a project to fix LOS, it's important to also consider the environmental impacts of doing so. There's also the issue in a couple of recent studies showed that LOS actually doesn't help us achieve the benefit that it's intended to. So LOS, of course, intended to keep traffic flowing. And while it may do so in an individual intersection that's improved near the project, that doesn't mean that people can get to destinations better overall, because more car travel congest the roadway network and essentially makes it not function as well on a regional scale. So there was a study done on this, and I've shown this slide in webinars, so it might look familiar to those of you who've been following our webinars and other office hours. The study showed, so it looked at two factors and compared them to job accessibility. So how easy it is for people to get to jobs, an accessibility metric, this one specifically for jobs. And on the left scatter plot, you see job accessibility. It's basically how many jobs you can get to, is compared against how many jobs are close by. So jobs within 6 miles, 10 kilometers. And it surprised no one that the closer, the more jobs close by, the more jobs you could get to. All right, that's not a surprise to anybody. However, it surprised a lot of people on the right that we found when we compared how many jobs you could get to how fast you could go in your neighborhood, 6 mile, 10 kilometer radius around. The faster you can go, you might think the more jobs you can get to, but it's actually the reverse. And this is robust across another area that used the same methods and did a study, both in California. So we're seeing that actually speed correlates inversely with ability to get places, in this case, jobs. It's unexpected. And that's simply because in order to keep higher vehicle speeds, you need to spread land uses out, and the spreading actually hurts our ability to get places more than the keeping speeds up helps. So this raises the question of, is LOS helping? And this study actually came to the answer of doubting that it helps achieve the fundamental goal of transportation, and that it actually appears to work against the fundamental goal of transportation, getting people to places. Okay, so this raises a question of whether it is actually an appropriate metric and request of projects for jurisdictions to make across the state. OPR doesn't provide legal advice, but just to note the general planning. So police powers, for those of you who haven't taken a planning law course, has nothing to do with the police as we've been seeing them on television, and they're not the police force that maintains that is in our cities, but is there's a different use of the term. Police powers in planning is essentially refers to a constitutional U.S. constitutional delegation of power to establish and enforce laws protecting the welfare, safety, and health of the public. So cities can establish laws, of course, to protect protect and enforce, can establish and enforce laws to protect the welfare, safety, and health of the public. But these studies are throwing into question whether LOS does that. Again, we're not providing legal advice on this, but it might be worth some thought and legal consultation. Okay, so we are so familiar with using LOS as we have in the last few decades to kind of do our transportation planning for us. Maybe not good transportation planning, but the many jurisdictions have kind of leaned on it as a crutch. Well, a project is coming in, will solve the LOS problem, and that'll expand the road, and the project will cover the costs of that, and there's our transportation planning. So SB 743 stops that from happening in a CEQA context, because LOS is no longer a metric of CEQA impact, and provides an opportunity for taking a pause and reconsidering whether that was a good approach in the first place, whether it led to the outcomes, whether it led to the city character that you were looking for in your jurisdiction, that your citizens were looking for. So just want to talk a little bit through what transportation planning can look like under SB 743. First, take the opportunity to stop and create a vision for your jurisdiction. What do you want your jurisdiction to look like? What do your citizens want your jurisdiction to be like? What values do you and they have? Then consider what transportation investments are needed to achieve that vision. And consider, when you're doing so, think broadly. Again, not just are we moving cars sufficiently through intersections? First, broaden to, are we moving cars sufficiently in the bigger picture? But then balance that with other factors. And think about other modes. Think about, people may want walkability over automobility, or those to be better balanced. It makes sense to focus, instead of on automobility, on access to destinations or accessibility. This fundamental, when you're thinking of the transportation interests at the table, well, those are getting people to places, not moving cars through intersections. Putting a metric of accessibility in place, as the state of Virginia has, is a very useful way forward. There's been some work done in Madison, Wisconsin, looking at accessibility metrics and saying, okay, if I plunk this transportation infrastructure in, does it help people get to their destinations better? How many people does it help, and how much? That helps me weigh the cost of that and any impact that that infrastructure might have with other factors like environmental impacts, greenhouse gases, air quality, open space, impervious surface, impacts to health, including opportunity to use active transportation, which can have really significant health benefits if people can build biking or walking to transit into their daily transportation routine. And there's also minimizing crash risk, thinking of speeds and VMT. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple slides. As well as cost, again, not just upfront cost, but long-term maintenance. So considering all those in your transportation investment decisions, and if there's a need for impact fee funding, as there often is in our Prop 13 world, then we recommend, rather than an LOS-based impact fee program, or worse, an LOS-based mitigation requirement, creating a VMT-based impact fee program, so that development that loads more vehicle travel, which is expensive to accommodate onto the roadway system, covers its costs. Okay, just to cover a couple other issues that questions have come up in the webinars and in previous office hours. The issue of safety. So people have raised, okay, so but traffic congestion. One of the justifications for using LOS and automobility has been, well, the ambulances and police and fire trucks are going to need to get through. This is a safety issue. We need to keep traffic moving. So I want to bring your attention to the research on that. Actually, I want to do that in a moment, but talk through kind of a bigger picture safety first. So we have a chapter of the General Plan Guidelines, this is Appendix B, and it's devoted to consideration of traffic safety generally, but also specifically in CEQA. And we did a review of the academic studies on safety. So it's again a traditional approach to say, well, we need to deal with safety issues by making it, by basically accommodating motorist error, leaving some space on the side of the road for if they swerve a little bit, essentially taking it as a given that we need to keep speeds up, and then seeing what we can do for safety within that. And as I've shown in other webinars, that's led to pretty poor outcomes. We in California and across the United States have a substantially higher, about double the traffic fatality rate of other countries that have taken different approaches. And that is largely due to the amount of vehicle travel and the sprawling land use patterns, which keep people needing to drive fast to get to their destinations in reasonable amounts of time. So a review of the literature pulled out kind of three major points for, three kind of centerpiece points for traffic safety. First, reducing speeds and increasing driver attention, so that features which require the driver to actually focus on driving help safety, rather than features that allow for driver error and allow a loss of driver attention. Protection of vulnerable road users is important for obvious reasons. They don't have cars with crumple zones around them. And also we've seen injuries and fatalities growing from with vulnerable road users, even as injury and fatality rates have gone down for motorists. So it's clear that that needs extra attention. And then reducing overall VMT and sprawl. More VMT creates more exposure, and sprawl requires high traffic speeds, which are dangerous. Okay, back to the emergency services point. So again, emergency services have often been a justification for retaining a metric like LOS, or an auto mobility metric. But it turns out when you look at the actual research, you get better emergency service, measure better response times with more compact and denser urban design in neighborhoods. So if things are closer together, the ambulance doesn't have so far to go, and the fire truck doesn't have so far to go, and the police don't have so far to go. And remember, they have sirens, so they can, to a decent extent, not perfectly, get through traffic. So they do have that benefit. But the research, the evidence that we have out there, the quote is here again, that it's covered a little more extensively in the general plan guidelines. Appendix B, you can pull up the academic research if you like yourself. But again, there's the density is actually associated with both more traffic and with better emergency response times. Okay, I want to move on from considerations around LOS and similar to a couple of questions that we got in the email, and then we will turn to your questions in the Q&A. I'm just going to take a peek here. Looks like good. We have a few questions populating the Q&A already. Okay, so this is a question from the Valley Transportation Authority. VTA has made available VMT data, residential per capita, employee per VMT per job, for all cities and the county of Santa Clara for a base year of 2015, the most recent year for which they've calibrated and validated the model with empirical data. They've run the model for horizon year of 2040 to generate the projected average VMT for each jurisdiction. In the recently released Santa Clara countywide evaluation tool, there is an option for lead agency to interpolate the base VMT figures in each zone parcel to current year figures. We included this to address the concern some agencies and consultants had to use a base year that is several years old. So I'll stop here, I'll pause here and make a couple points. One is that we are comparing to existing VMT, and another is that we are using the best, CEQA requires to use the best available information. Sometimes that's going to be model data from 5 years ago. Sometimes it's going to be model data from a year ago. Sometimes it'll be big data from GPS from perhaps more recently or average over time. For example, here's an example where it wouldn't make sense to use most recent data, and that's right now. You wouldn't want to base your analysis on the unusual travel patterns that are going on right now as a result of COVID, or certainly April's VMT. So that is an important point. You want to use the best available information, and that might be the most recent information, but it might not be also. Okay, continuing on with the question, if we use interpolated base figures, like interpolated to the year 2020, do we need to shift the threshold figures as well? In other words, instead of 15% below the 2015 citywide average, make the threshold 15% below the interpolated 2020 average. It ends up being a kind of dog chasing its tail exercise, where if the base VMT figures are shifted by 1% from 2015 to 2020, the threshold's also shifted by -1%. the results of an individual project evaluation are the same, but at least the lead agency can say it's using 2020 figures. So I'd return again to what I just shared of using the best available data and interpolating. But what is kind of good practice under CEQA is show your work. So if you're showing that you could make an adjustment and it would make no effect, and you've shown that work, great. There you are. You can use the original data. VMT, as was LOS, as with other figures, is probably not knowable to 0.1, 1% in a lot of cases. We're using tools that have some error in them always for any CEQA analysis, for any impact, usually for most any impact, and certainly across transportation. This was very certainly the case with LOS, where we actually sometimes misrepresented the precision with which we knew information. A lot of the travel model figures providing volumes at individual intersections, when you look closely, were plus or minus a third or so, and then we were claiming 2 and 3 and 4 decimal point accuracy off of that when we didn't have one significant figure. Again, all this is lead agency discretion, but the bigger picture interest in CEQA is getting things as a good faith effort and using the best available data. Things that shift by a fraction of a percent are probably not is probably not fair to consider them too relevant in this context. Okay, I'll move on to another question, and Rob or others at VTA, please feel free to ask follow-up questions in the chat. Here's another question we received on the email, two-part question regarding how a project adding on-site student housing at an existing community college campus, how it should be analyzed. So would considering the potential for the project to affect absolute VMT be appropriate rather than a residential VMT per capita metric? Intuitively, there would be a definitive reduction in the college's total VMT production, quantifying presumably because people were driving from off campus and now they would be on campus, so they wouldn't need to do much less driving. That's my assumption. Quantifying the baseline VMT and the potential effects of a student housing could, however, be rather complex and costly. Could a qualitative approach suffice? So I would recommend actually looking right back at the method we recommend for residential in OPR's technical advisory, and that is rather than considering total VMT, which we don't recommend for residential and office, essentially bring new people. And so, I mean, even in this case, if there's college students that live in the area and you're adding new residential and they're moving into it, somebody's going to move into the space, the residence they were in. So you're essentially adding capacity for new people in California. That's generally, we're going to get those new people. There's a lot of demand for housing in California. But we wouldn't recommend trying to account for all that, partly for the reason that's brought up here, and that it's the modeling exercise is unnecessarily challenging. Instead, look at the amount of vehicle travel that is likely to be generated by the residents in the campus, the dormitories, the campus housing, and compare that, as we suggest, to the regional or city average and see whether it's 15% below. Students tend to generate pretty low VMT because they tend to bike and walk a lot. Many of them don't have to have vehicles. So it's going to very often, except in the least travel efficient locations, maybe even then, that a student housing is going to come in under, at least I'm imagining student housing is going to come in under the threshold that we recommend. So again, in sum, apply the recommendations from the technical advisory that we have for residential. That's our recommendation here. Okay, so with that, we're going to move on to questions that you're asking here on this webinar. I hope that information that we just shared has been useful. But let's make sure we get to the questions here. So as I pull up the chat box, William, if you have anything queued up, feel free to ask it.
We do have a top voted question. Before I get to that question, let me just remind folks that at the bottom of your screen where it says Q&A, you can not only add your question to the conversation, but you can upvote questions that are already on deck. We currently have 8 questions on deck. We have until noon. So I encourage you, if you're listening, to continue to think of questions to ask, and also take a look at the questions that are in the queue to see if you'd like to upvote any of the questions that are on deck. Our first question: what criteria do you recommend using for map-based screening of low VMT areas? Should the screening criteria be consistent with the agency's VMT threshold, for example, 15% below existing average?
Yeah, thanks for that question. The short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is lead agencies have the legal authority to set their own significance thresholds under CEQA. That said, consider the context that VMT, that 743, asked us to connect, the law asked us to connect VMT with greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And in fact, the California Air Resources Board has done some careful and thoughtful work crosswalking state greenhouse gas emissions goals. And those goals are, again, enshrined in law. They're not just casual goals in the state, they're legal goals. And so those, it follows that if you are generating an amount of VMT that is not consistent with climate goals, that it would seem hard to make an argument that that's not a significant impact. So cognizant of that, yes, we do recommend using the 15% below existing, meaning city or regional average, and then basing those maps on that significance threshold. Thanks for the question.
Great. The next question: how was 15% reduction in VMT determined as the threshold, and is there reference documentation?
Yes, so thanks for that question. The California Air Resources Board did the work to crosswalk against state climate goals with individual projects, what an individual project would need to hit, and again came to that approximately 15% below existing. And in our guidance, we suggest 15% below regional or city VMT per capita for residential, and 15% below regional VMT per employee for office. That, if you want to take a deeper dive in that paper is on the, I believe it's on the kind of first screen you look at. You don't have to scroll down much, if at all, on the SB 743 website, on OPR's webpage on OPR's website.
All right.
Thanks.
Next question. Several councils of government have sent letters to the governor to delay the implementation by 1 or 2 years. Is July 1st still the date?
The short answer is yes, July 1st is still the date. That is in the regulation. There's not, so far as I know, an opportunity to change that without redoing the regulation. But also, we're cognizant of the need for the streamlining SB 743 will provide, as well as in coming out of during the recovery from our economic situation brought on by COVID in the state. We still have a housing crisis, housing affordability crisis coming out of this situation, and so we're going to need the streamlining the 743 provides. And also, we still are facing a climate crisis. The wildfire season is upon us and is going to be likely, and unfortunately, providing us some stark reminders of that. Saw on the news this morning, there's already some wildfires burning. So that mitigation from high VMT development is going to be important to keep our climate commitments that are to follow the law, essentially, that we have on climate. So July 1 is still the date in which all CEQA documents are expected to use VMT, generally speaking. Thanks.
Great. Should a universal vehicle miles traveled mitigation calculator be developed that agencies statewide can download for consistency rather than have individual agencies develop their own calculators unique to their location?
Yeah, we consider doing something like this. There's a couple reasons that we didn't. One is that it's funny, for every question we get suggesting or nudging us towards statewide consistent, we probably get a few saying that we're our unique jurisdiction, we're so different from everybody else. We need to do our own thing. So we shot the middle ground in that, in recommending thresholds of significance, basically yoking them to regional and city averages. But this is actually important. So, for example, the factors you'd want a model to be sensitive to in San Francisco compared to what you'd want them to be sensitive to in Oakdale or Fresno or Outer Kern County are different factors. So you actually may want to use models, different models, because it's actually important to use models that are sensitive to the factors in your individual jurisdiction. So there are some general models to use. CaliMod is a good example, and they're in the process of updating. I think over the next several months or a year or so, they're going to be updating that model. I'm pretty sure they're going to be doing it with, I'm hard to imagine they wouldn't be doing it with 743 in mind, but that I do know for a fact they'll be doing it. It will be, as it always has, reporting at VMT figures. So there are some general models to use. There are cities, on the other hand, that have developed their own models. For you, San Jose and Los Angeles have done this with locally calibrated data. There are also regions or subregions that have done so. VTA has helped its constituent jurisdictions by developing an approach that helps supply them with data and VMT information, so that can be done on really a variety of scales. Thanks for that question.
Great. Regarding VMT mitigation banks, does the analysis to confirm the efficacy of the mitigation banks require approval at the state level?
Technically, no. It wouldn't require approval at the state, like most things with CEQA, and I'm going to get a little out of my depth legally here. So, well, I'll just note that I don't have off the tip of my tongue the exact sort of legal requirement for the veracity of a mitigation bank's VMT. I'll just mention the general principles that are important. One, a mitigation bank, of course, has, just by definition, a bunch of VMT reducing projects, and somebody is going to have to verify the depth of VMT mitigation each of those projects would create. So there's a technical thing there. There's not necessarily a state function, although there is some. We are looking at the state at doing that, at developing a mitigation bank, or we're looking into developing a mitigation bank at the state level. I know there's also some interest in doing that at other levels, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. So it does require verification of the VMT reduction from the projects in the bank. That has to be of good quality. That assessment has to be of good quality, and then also important is additionality. So if that project was going to happen anyways, and then another development's asked to pay for it, well, that's not really doing anything to reduce VMT. So you have to show that the project wasn't going to happen without the mitigation bank funding it. So those are two of the kind of technical factors. There's some legal factors as well. Again, not necessarily at the state level. Thanks for that question.
Great. What role does LOS have in consideration of wildfire evacuation and public safety, especially in high wildfire risk areas?
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's a relevant question today as we see strong winds and red flag warnings. So there's two sides. I guess I'll say one thing generally. Across all generalized emergencies, whether you look at the Oroville Dam failure risk of a few years ago, whether you look at wildfire evacuation that we've seen in many places, most strikingly and unfortunately tragically in Paradise, and looking at other parts of the country at hurricane evacuation. Without a good amount of warning, auto evacuation isn't very functional. We will never have sufficient auto capacity in most places to get everyone down a road all at the same time in an emergency that's pressing like a wildfire. So we need to think a little more broadly than moving automobiles. Certainly we need to think about moving automobiles. We need to think about what part of the evacuation that will serve. So whether LOS is a factor, it's a question that requires some context. Certainly, you want to be thinking about how, whether in an emergency you want to set a traffic light to green in the direction everybody will be evacuating, whether it makes sense to have a two-way road turn into a one-way road, both lanes going away from the danger, whether those approaches are possible. It's also important to consider that our transportation investments are probably the biggest factor in land use, in how our land use grows and where people choose to live and build other land uses. So if we are providing auto mobility, if we're providing auto capacity into, for example, fire zones, we're likely to see more development pressure there and ultimately more development. And we need to think proactively and ahead, also in addition to thinking about reactive responses to get people who are there out in emergencies. So thanks for that question. It's a good and important one.
Great. Next question. The participant has a sediment removal project for a dam, which will occur for 5 years, utilizing a large number of heavy trucks. And after those 5 years, the heavy truck trips will end. Generally, OPR recommends that heavy trucks do not need to be analyzed with VMT. However, what type of qualitative statement should be made about the lack of VMT analysis for heavy trucks? Does a statement regarding the heavy trucks even need to be made?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I'm going to have a definitive answer to it. Also, pardon our challenge in reading the questions occasionally. One will get upvoted past the question that's being read, and so the question jumps around in the midst of our reading it. Thanks, William, for your deft ability to follow that one around. Right. So, yeah, as the question, as Kent says, we are not looking under the VMT metric at truck traffic, at heavy duty vehicle traffic. We're focusing on passenger vehicle traffic, and that is in both the guidelines and and clarified even further in the technical advisory. So do you need to do a qualitative statement about the lack of VMT analysis for heavy trucks, or about the VMT of the heavy trucks? I think strictly speaking, no. The question would be, because you're not needing to consider trucks, truck VMT. Of course, this doesn't mean that you're not considering the truck traffic in your other impact categories. There may be air quality impacts, there may be noise impacts or other impacts under CEQA, and it should be, that truck traffic should be considered there. But while I don't have a definitive answer, following from that we're not looking at truck traffic, VMT is not looking at truck traffic, would mean that you don't need to think about that. You don't need to consider that even in a qualitative fashion.
Well, I would recommend that this questioner or participant send an email if you need further clarification to sb743questions@opr.ca.gov. We do monitor that account. So I would recommend anyone that if you're hearing responses and you need further clarification, you're welcome to submit another question in the Q&A, but you're also welcome to continue to use the email address to correspond with us, and we will provide that at the end of the office hours presentation. Our next question.
I'll put it up right now for just a minute while we're
Sure.
and then I'll go back. This is our final slide, but I'm just going to put it up so people have the.
That's our email address, sb743questions@opr.ca.gov. Definitely use that after the office hours presentation. Definitely try to use our Q&A function at the bottom of your screen.
Yeah, just to be clear, we're not monitoring the 743 questions email during this. So if you wanted to answer during this presentation, use the Q&A as well said. But this email is here for you to shoot us your questions, and please do feel free to use it.
Great. In the preparation of a mitigated negative declaration for a residential project that appears to qualify for exemption from the VMT impact assessment requirement, would a lead agency need to make a statement that the project is consistent with the adopted sustainable communities strategy?
Preparation of a mitigated appears to qualify for exemption. I don't see that there would be a problem with doing so, but I also don't see a need to do so. So maybe if there was, so where we recommend in our technical advisory, in our advisory, that SES consistency is important is basically it's kind of on the flip side. If you are building a project in an area that is clearly delineated as open space in the SCS, or is clearly contradicts the SCS in a transit area, then you in a transit area, you may not, it may disqualify you from the presumption of less than significant impact. And in green space, that might suggest a significant transportation impact because you're building somewhere the SCS didn't contemplate building, the SCS being the transportation plan for the region. So there's not an explicit need for the lead agency to make a statement that the project is consistent with the SCS, but it could, if that was a topic of debate and someone was trying to raise those concerns unfoundedly. Consistency with the SCS, of course, is different than being less than significant for VMT, because VMT is looking at measurements, whereas the SCS is a broader document. It's kind of a land use plan / vision that is tied to different targets than the state, different and less strict targets than the state climate targets. Yeah. Thanks.
Great. All right. The questioner asks, or the questioner states that they see many larger cities developing their own thresholds and some smaller cities grouping together to do so. But is there a disadvantage to going by OPR's technical advisory?
So the advantage that we see to following the technical advisory that we've provided. Again, a lead agency has the prerogative to develop its own significance thresholds. However, or alongside that, the California Air Resources Board has, as I mentioned earlier, done the crosswalking work to show what levels of VMT are compatible with state climate goals enshrined in law. And so if a jurisdiction was going to move forward with a less environmentally protective threshold, the concern would be that there's a very strong substantial evidence that any petitioner could bring to show that there is in fact a significant impact despite being above that significance threshold. Meanwhile, a number of cities have applied more environmentally protective thresholds, essentially lower VMT thresholds, and CEQA explicitly allows for more environmentally protective thresholds where the lead agency chooses to apply those. So essentially, we think that there is great advantage to going with our recommendations because of all the substantial evidence behind them that we've provided in our technical advisory, or more environmentally protective thresholds because CEQA explicitly allows that. Thank you.
Great. In the OPR technical advisory, there is a statement that maps created with VMT data can identify areas that are below the threshold VMT. Is this threshold VMT related to the agency's VMT threshold they adopt?
Yeah, correct. This is a pretty short answer. Yes, it's just mapping out the threshold. And again, I won't reiterate again. I've already gone through a couple times why we recommend the particular thresholds we do.
Great. Lake Tahoe populations have historically been on a downward trend, and there are existing controls in land development and sprawl. VMT is most notably associated with interregional travel from the approximately 24 million annual visitors that access the basin, mostly by personal vehicle, 85% from the states of California and Nevada. The VMT approach proposed does not take into consideration the differences between the source of VMT and the potential opportunity to mitigate those impacts by only focusing on project-induced VMT and only considering regional VMT. There's no question here.
I'm gonna attempt to grapple with it anyways. The VMT approach proposed does not take into consideration the differences between the source of VMT and the potential opportunity to mitigate those impacts by only focusing on project-induced and only considering regional VMT. So I think there may be a misunderstanding here. I'm not sure. Please, Danielle, feel free to clarify with a follow-up question if I don't understand your question or your comment correctly. Essentially, 743 requires looking at VMT over the full effect of the project. And if the project draws very long trips in, then it is important to look at the full span. We specifically recommend against truncating the modeling of trips or the consideration of trips at regional boundaries. So in a case where there may be a tourist draw and really long distances traveled, the bad news is that there's a lot of VMT to induced or attracted, in the technical transportation engineering term, a lot of VMT caused, but where there's a lot of VMT causes opportunity for a lot of VMT mitigation. There's actually a project in the Tahoe Basin. I'm not intimately familiar with it, but a transportation consultant was describing it to me recently. That just did pretty massive VMT reduction. It was, I'm not sure that it was all on site. It might have been, it involved a lot of parking reduction in a parking pressured area. But you can imagine, I'm just thinking in the Tahoe area specifically, there are as we all know who live in Northern California, a lot of single occupancy, or not single occupancy, but some single occupancy, but automobiles that drive from concentrated population centers across long distances to get to Tahoe every weekend and back at the end of the weekend. And so there's with people all going the same way, there's a great potential to move them more efficiently, whether it's via a bus, potentially train. There's one rail line that runs to the Truckee area. But there's great potential for reducing long distance VMT. So I'm not sure if that got at the question or comment, but please, Danielle, feel free to follow up if I didn't.
Great. So we're approaching the halfway mark of the webinar. We have about 5 questions on deck. We may be ending early if we only have now 6 questions on deck. So I want to direct you all to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. This is where you can engage live on a Zoom webinar with the OPR staff about your questions about SB 743 implementation. You're also welcome to upvote questions, which folks have been doing. So we definitely appreciate that. It helps us get the questions that have the most interest answered. So again, we have an hour left in our office hours presentation. This is open office hours. It's a presentation of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. I'm William Walker. I'm joined by Senior Advisor for Transportation, Chris Ganson, counsels Jeannie Lee and Natalie Cuffel, and our Special Assistant, Alyssa Montanez. So please join us in answering asking your questions, and we will do our best to answer them. Kathleen asks, the slides with the scatter chart showing speed and accessibility to jobs was based on the San Francisco Bay Area. San Francisco has the most robust transit system. Have similar studies been done for urban areas with poor quality transit? She suggests Orange County is an area that might not have as robust a system as San Francisco.
Yes, and thanks for asking. The answer is yes. That same study was done with the same results for the greater Los Angeles area. City of Los Angeles, of course, has decent and improving transit. The greater area has less, and including the Orange County. It actually includes the Orange County area, to my knowledge. So yeah, and similar results.
And I'd also add that San Francisco is just one of 9 counties in the Bay Area, and there are probably some parts of the Bay Area and Orange County that are similar as well. So next question. CEQA requires impacts to be mitigated. However, project VMT mitigation may not show effectiveness until the projects are fully occupied. Further, the transportation strategies outlined in CAPCOA recommended as CEQA impact mitigation may not be as effective. How can those CAPCOA strategies be justified as CEQA mitigation if the mitigation still needs to be evaluated in the future? Are qualitative strategies enough for CEQA? And before you answer that question, I always have to look up CAPCOA, California Air Pollution Control Officers Association.
Thank you. Great acronym. Always a little bit of a mouthful, though.
Yes.
So, and the guide has been very useful over the years, and that also, just so everybody is aware, is in the process of being updated. Okay, so I'll take this running backward. A qualitative strategy is enough for CEQA. In certain circumstances, there, of course, this is the lead agency's call ultimately, but where quantitative approaches are just overkill, where the analysis is a huge budget, which is less often going to be the case with VMT because it's a lot lower cost than LOS analyses were. But that might be an appropriate time for a qualitative analysis. So CEQA does require impacts to be mitigated when there are significant and where mitigation is feasible. So project VMT mitigation may not show effectiveness until the projects are fully occupied. That's true, and also the VMT would not be in full force, generated or resulting from the project would not be in full force until the project was fully occupied either. Transportation strategies outlined CAPCOA recommended as CEQA impact may not be as effective. I'm not sure exactly as effective as what. There's certainly, CAPCOA, the CAPCOA documented studies, are generalized. So there may be a situation in which one of them is not appropriate for use in a certain situation, is not relevant. So that's important to keep an eye on. But again, CEQA requires using the best available information, the best available science often. And again, often that's going to be imperfect, but but we're looking here for not perfection. We're looking for a good faith effort at a good forecast of VMT. So how can CAPCOA strategies be justified as CEQA mitigation if mitigation still needs to be evaluated in the future? So at CEQA, you're always assessing a future impact in CEQA because you're assessing a project that hasn't yet been built. We're trying under CEQA to get our arms around what the environmental effects of a project that doesn't exist yet will be. And to do that, in some cases, it's very simple and straightforward, like we're going to have to cut down 50 trees. In other cases, we need to make projections and forecasts as for transportation, LOS or VMT. So again, using the best available information to do so. And we've seen quite a bit of use of the CAPCOA strategies for VMT and GHGs over the year, and think that those are, generally speaking, appropriate. Of course, again, you need to look at your particular circumstances, and lead agency needs to make the call. The question also alludes to mitigation monitoring, which can also play an important role.
And
So,
Chris, this is Jeannie. I was also going to mention the mitigation monitoring aspect. The city of San Jose did talk about this in one of our earlier webinars, and they were talking about how they go, part of their mitigation and monitoring program involves, I guess, what they're calling project performance monitoring. And so this question just reminds me of the importance of needing to have a good MMRP in place. And later, under CEQA, mitigation measures that have been adopted and approved, they can be modified or deleted if the agency gives a legitimate reason and if there's substantial evidence to support the modification or deletion.
All right.
Thanks, Jeannie.
Thank you, Jeannie, Chief Counsel for OPR. Next question. Given the guidance to not include truck traffic in VMT analysis, does the 110 daily trip threshold for VMT analysis include truck trips? For example, a use that may have 10 employees but will generate hundreds of truck trips. Is this screened out?
Yeah, this again, ultimately lead agency call. We provide substantial evidence. You can take a look at it in the technical advisory for the 110 daily trip threshold for screening out small projects. But off the cuff, my suggestion would be that you could you could leave truck traffic out of that calculation. Thanks.
Great. Follow up on the truck traffic question. You may need to substantially improve the road. For example, ease curves, widen for standard width lanes, even if not technically adding them, repave the lanes to support the truck traffic. And the improved road will certainly remain afterward, which could improve access. What level of VMT analysis would be needed to address these?
So if the road improvement, in order for the road improvement to have an effect on VMT, it would need to make it, it would need to increase capacity or otherwise make it easier for people to get places. So it would need to be a pretty substantial, improvement beyond, I think, what we would typically see to support construction in order to trigger induced travel and a VMT impact itself. So I would just suggest looking through the lens. We have a recommendations on how to consider induced travel in the technical advisory, and we have recommendations on what sorts of projects would probably not need to include an induced travel analysis, or would not add a measurable or substantial amount of VMT, and so need not be assessed. So I would go to that and take a look at what our recommendations in the technical advisory and follow those.
While we're still on trucks, there is one last question. It's not in order, so don't be alarmed. Can you briefly describe the rationale precluding truck traffic from being analyzed under SB 743?
Sure. We had a detailed look at, we should say we consulted a number of experts and kind of ran through a number of scenarios, had conversations with ports and other freight related uses, and realized that there was going to not be any real information, useful information disclosed by looking at VMT truck traffic, nor useful opportunity for mitigation, and that the that those impacts are, or sorry, that the impacts of truck traffic are generally well captured and much more appropriately captured in other impact categories, noise, air pollution, et cetera.
Great. What would your recommendation be for analyzing a freeway interchange improvement project that includes minor capacity increasing elements for traffic entering and exiting the freeway? Possibly an auxiliary lane?
Right. So minor capacity. So this would be a little bit of a gray area. And Sparky, feel free to follow up with this if you want to get more specific. So it depends on the level of capacity added. If it's a kind of a straightening of a curve or a reconfiguration of a ramp to make it a different shape, but that there's not lanes added, that kind of thing, then that probably falls in the category of not needing to do an induced travel analysis. If the improvement project, it depends on what's meant by minor capacity increasing elements for traffic exiting under the freeway. Yeah, again, if that's an auxiliary lane, you need to look at the length of it and whether it behaves as a normal travel lane and whether it essentially adds to roadway capacity in any sort of significant way, in any sort of substantial way, on the freeway.
That's why we have you answering the questions, because there's always more than one answer. So I appreciate your nuance there. Per OPR technical advisory, proposed auxiliary lanes on the state highway system that are 1,000 feet or less can be screened out for VMT analysis. Does the 1,000-foot lane length need to include the striped transition zone? In other words, if a proposed auxiliary lane on the state highway system is really 2,000 feet long, including the striped transition zone where cars can weave in and out, with the transition zone being 1,000 feet, would Caltrans be able to screen out the auxiliary lane based on only on consideration of the 1,000 feet that does not include the transition zone?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I'll be able to give a definitive answer here. Caltrans is currently doing work on how it assesses induced travel and considers its significance under CEQA. And they just, in fact, had documents out for public comment, which they just took back in-house and are setting about examining those comments and making revisions to those documents in response to them. So I don't want to go far out on a limb here and something that Caltrans is in the middle of considering, but just generally speaking and how to think through this sort of issue, the question is whether capacity is increased, right? And if the auxiliary lane is so short that it's basically serving as an on-ramp and an off-ramp, and it's not essentially serving as a capacity increase, then it's not going to induce additional vehicle travel, or certainly not noticeable or measurable. And so it would be appropriate to screen out. If it were longer, if it were really more like a capacity addition, then it would be appropriate to include. I'm not equipped at the moment to advise on exact lengths that would mean that. It's also important to look, so an auxiliary lane will have some weaving. The idea is people are getting on and off, and so there's cars weaving between the auxiliary lane and the main line, and the main line and the auxiliary lane, and that reduces the capacity of the auxiliary lane. You can't have a car, you can squeeze in fewer cars when cars are weaving between lanes. So if it were deemed appropriate to examine and look at the induced travel of the auxiliary lane, it would be prudent to consider that change in capacity, that variation in capacity compared to a normal general purpose lane. Now that applies for the area in which there's weaving. If you have a 3 mile long or even 2 mile long or full mile long auxiliary lane, you're probably any longer than that, you're probably not going to be able to justify that the whole thing is acting as a weaving zone. So be realistic about that assessment as well. So sorry, I'm not answering that question completely definitively, but there's some pieces to the answer that hopefully are useful.
Great. I just want to remind folks that this might be a great time for you to answer I keep asking folks to answer questions. I want you to ask your questions.
If anybody wants to answer questions, that's fine too.
Use the Q&A function below to ask your questions. We're going to do our best to answer them. I'm at my last question, and I have some ideas of what we could do until noon that I have not sprung on my team, but we'll get to that after we answer what might be our final question for this open office hours. How would you address a situation where a local agency's policy may conflict with the advisory put forth by OPR? Specifically, a project which is mapped within a high VMT area by local policy, but is clearly within 1/2 mile of a major transit stop and would be screened according to OPR guidance.
How do you address a situation where local agencies' policy may conflict with the advisory put forth by OPR? Okay. And then that is project which is mapped with a higher VMT within a high VMT area by local policy, but okay. So there's the exhibiting the project is in an area exhibiting high VMT. So the thinking of this particular, if the project were in a high VMT area but were also near transit, and if it's essentially transit oriented, meaning that it's making it easy for the people using the project to use transit, then it's our recommendation to presume that project less than significant. And that simply means that we would expect it to be less than significant, and but a presumption does provide the opportunity for for someone to carry substantial evidence to the table and say, look, I have evidence that it's going to actually be a higher VMT project. I think that answers the question. Feel free to follow up if it didn't. And William, I'll just recommend that we just leave a couple minutes for people to ponder and either follow up on questions or ask new questions.
We definitely should do that.
Yeah, we can.
I wanted to posit. I mean, we have a website. We have screen sharing capabilities.
That's true. We could do a quick walk through the website.
Yeah. That's
okay.
my thought.
We have another question for now, and I'll take that on. Yeah, thanks for that suggestion. Actually, I will do that.
All right. So the question that did come in while we ponder that. Yeah. Will there be further guidance on how to proceed with high occupancy toll lane VMT analysis needs, as they are a combination of high occupancy vehicle and toll lanes, which means they do not completely fit in the descriptions of either category?
Right. This is going to be a focus, I believe, of Caltrans's guidance ultimately, and hopefully the version that comes out next. I'm working with them some to grapple with the questions of what sorts of lane maladditions, what substantial evidence and research to bring to bear on assessing different lane types. So HOV and toll lanes, right? Which means exactly. Right. So yeah, do expect some further guidance on that. I mean, essentially, what you probably won't be able to use on hot lanes is the kind of first and foremost recommended approach that we have had in our guidance for the past 4+ years of using the elasticities from the academic literature, and those have more recently, over the last year plus, been operationalized by something called the Induced Travel Calculator, put out by the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. That tool is great for assessing induced VMT from general purpose lanes or HOV lanes across much of the state, but probably not the right tool for HOT toll lanes. We're still looking into that, but at this point, that's the evidence that I have in hand. So that would then go to the kind of next tier, the travel demand model, which is more cumbersome to use and have a kind of a number of known issues that tend to bias them towards low evaluations. But you can compensate for those, some of them off model at least, and that may be the best available tool to use for a hot lane. Great. So we'll leave the Q&A box up for the webinar, and I will pull the PowerPoint down and put our website up. Let's see if I can do it gracefully. Give me just a moment. There we go. Great. There's my email for everyone.
I'm like, I can do it if you want. I'm ready.
No, I got it. I just have to fiddle around just a bit.
I'm springing this on Chris, so we appreciate the audience. I'm saying
that's fine.
On you, so I'm letting the audience know I appreciate their patience because I didn't prepare you for this.
Yeah. No, thank you for begging everyone's patience. And let's see if I can full screen this. Okay, so here is that showing up for you? Well, Will?
It is. If you could maximize your browser,
I did. Is it not looking maximized?
It looks like you dragged it across your screen versus like if you hit the maximize button, but it's here.
Yeah, I did in fact hit the maximize button.
Okay, we can see it.
It's visible. Okay, good enough, I guess.
Good enough for government
work. Is that what you're gonna say? Yeah. here
I
we
don't know
are
if I should have
doing
said
government
that.
work.
Instead,
Okay, so
now.
I should go back for a moment. So you can navigate to, it's a little tricky. The way to navigate to the 743 webpage is hover over CEQA, not pressing, and then come down here and press Transportation SV 743. So again, hovering over and coming down, selecting 743 for those of you who haven't been here before. I'm gonna just fess up that we're in bad need of a website update, and we're working on that. But in the meantime, the information you need is all here. Or we have quite a, I shouldn't say the information all the information you need is certainly here, but we have a lot of information here that we think is quite helpful. The technical advisory is maybe first and foremost, provides all of the recommendations we've been sharing, including methods for analysis, recommendations for significance thresholds, etc. We went through it fairly comprehensively during the webinars, which you can review, are up on our YouTube channel. The link to our YouTube channel is here. And you can also find that, I'm gonna go back for a moment, if you come to OPR's website and hit our YouTube button, that gets you to our YouTube channel, then to the recordings of all of our office hours. Oh, here we are right now. I won't click on that. It'll probably cause the universe to explode or something.
Please don't
Fold in itself. Who knows what would happen? Okay, so back to the 743 webpage. Another way to get to that YouTube channel is this link. We have 4 narrated slideshows, each of which is fairly short. It is a lot of overlap in the coverage with the webinars, but these go deeper on their individual topics in some cases. Feel free to have a look at those. Again, they cover issues that are covered in the technical advisory, but are a little more palatable if you want to forward something to someone who may not have a ton of technical depth, but need kind of a quick study, a 5 to 8 minute video. Sometimes these are appropriate. Also, they take enough of a dive that they can help provide details and answers to some of the questions you may have on these topics. I mentioned a few times the California Air Resources Board has a document crosswalking state climate goals in law to project level, the project level, and we recommend those are used as thresholds. That's this document right here. I'll click into it just to briefly show it to you. You can download it on this website. Its name is long, the CARB 2017 Scoping Plan, identified VMT reductions in relationships to state climate goals. Okay, back to our website. So the next thing down here are key resources for 743, and we have a whole bunch of categories. There's a lot here. I think I may have mentioned already that we have, or I'm not sure whether I did, that we have a few broken links here, and so we need to set to fixing them. We'll try and get that done in the next week. Here, for example, is an ITE journal article from a few years back on use of LOS and some of the issues that it raises, again, in the Institute of Transportation Engineers journal. We talked a little bit about the study Congested Development. This is the study that contains, if you scroll down a little ways, these 2 scatter plots that I've shown on many a presentation. This is the version, someone from Orange County asked, or I'm presuming they were from Orange County, asked about Orange County, and this is the relevant study for that area. Again, same results as from the Bay Area. I don't think that it's the amount of transit supplied that is a really key factor here. But I think it's more of a natural phenomenon across different cities. So at least the 2 cities that have gotten or the 2 metropolitan areas that have gotten careful study have shown the same results. So there is a section on the environmental health and fiscal benefits of VMT reduction, including a survey of the academic literature connecting VMT to other environmental impacts, performed or undertaken by the, put together by the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. There is the study from which I've brought health effects, the 2,100 lives that we would save per year by hitting our mode share targets. That's from this second study here. And then there's some reports on reducing VMT and creating better outcomes fiscally, more on health, et cetera here. There's also a section on VMT reduction strategies featuring that CAP-COA guidance we discussed earlier, but also a few other sources. There's a whole set here of briefs that the California Air Resources Board has put up on its website. You might consider looking at these for mitigation ideas, particularly some project level mitigation, but some also more jurisdiction level mitigation. We have a section on induced travel. The induced travel calculator I mentioned is at this link. You have to scroll down to induced travel calculator, and here it is. There's a few things to click through. And you can use that again. If you haven't seen this used, it's very easy to use. You pick whether you're looking at an interstate or other state highway, your location, since we're in Sacramento, and then you input the lane mileage. So we're adding 10 lane miles to a highway, and click, and it very quickly gives you a research-based amount of additional vehicle travel. Again, induced travel is what we call that, that you can expect to see. Okay, getting back to our website, more on induced travel. There are some research briefs that look at the academic literature. Here is one of them. This is also done by the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, and is a quick 2-page summary of the academic literature on induced travel. Great, handy, quicker summary. There is a longer, more 10-page size summary on the California Air Resources Board's website. You can link to it here or here. I think that might be one of the broken links, so we might need to fix, but you can go directly to it on their website. And then there's a couple of the couple most recent studies, major studies on induced travel are this one and this one. And then there's actually a study here. There's a study here, or where is it? It's here. It's an academic article on the history of our study of induced travel and why we have not succeeded, or excuse me, to bring induced travel studies into our transportation infrastructure decision making. Continue the tour, some resources on automated vehicles and their effect on vehicle travel, some tools to measure access to destination, VMT and access to destinations, some resources on affordable housing and VMT generation, some resources on VMT reduction in rural areas, some resources on roadway pricing, which is an approach that can substantially reduce vehicle travel and improve traffic at the same time. And there's some research showing that it leads to that it can be done in very equitable ways, and that it has oftentimes equitable impacts. And then some information on traffic safety, again, I already alluded to. The rest is some history. If you want to look at our old documents, old versions of our advisory, those are down here at the bottom. So that's a quick tour of our website. See whether we have any additional questions at this point, and also put up our question email. Excuse me, running out of voice.
We do have a question about other places that you can look for resources for SB 743 related information. If you know of any partner websites or anything that you'd recommend outside of our resource.
Let's see. So I guess that here there's a question pointing out the 743.org website. That was a project of Portland State University, which was hired by Caltrans and MPOs, a few MPOs, to do some case study work. And if you want to see the products of that case study work, that's available for you. I know there are some consultants that have some information up on their websites. Caltrans has a very good SB 743 website. I would recommend looking at that. And then we just took a tour of ours. So there's quite a bit of quite a lot of resources on ours as well. We should put at a minimum the Caltrans website link to that, so everyone should be aware of Caltrans' good website in 743. Right. Those are the ones I'm aware of at the top of mind.
We will be sure to put that information front and center on our website as we are in the process of updating that. Chief Counsel Jeannie Lee. Hi.
Hello.
Just wanted to see if you had any wise words for us. I know you're still here, hanging out. Anything you need to add, or anything that we've missed? I don't have any legal questions that I could tell. Well, we kind of had one legal-ish question. You did.
Yeah, Jeannie jumped in on it ably. Yeah, Jeannie, any final words from you? No pressure. I know you're also like many of you out there are. Jeannie is both helping run this webinar and caring for a small child. There's an extra challenge associated with that.
Yeah, I don't have anything else to add. We continue to look forward to answering all of your questions, and we know that people have still been asking questions through the 743 email. We are getting a lot, so thank you everyone for your patience.
Yeah, so we'll be here in office hours next week. Will, do you want to tee that up, and we'll wind down?
Yeah, we'll be here for office hours. Our final installment. It's June 24th from 10 a.m. to 12 noon. Will be brought to you by this same able and capable team. Senior Advisor for Transportation, Chris Ganson, Chief Counsel, Jeannie Lee, Land Use Counsel, Natalie Kuffel, Special Assistant, Alyssa Montanez, and myself, Associate Planner, William Walker. We also may have some other developments coming up with trying to get more information to you in the next couple of weeks around more information that you might be able to use in your implementation processes. So I would say, please stay close to the SB 743 website that we just gave you a tour of. The OPR website also will have announcements in regard to SB 743 implementation. The most recent announcement for our department was from this team. So continue to watch our announcements page to interact with us at this SB 743 questions at opr.ca.gov. We will come back to you again physically distanced from our respective locations in Sacramento and, for the time being, San Francisco. Any other additions from my team before we? I think that's
it. Will, thanks so much for running the show. Thanks to everybody for attending today and bringing your good questions and sharing them in a venue where other people can learn from them as well. We're really excited about the July 1 deadline coming forward. We know it can be a lot of work. It doesn't have to be, but many of you are trying to do implementations of 743 that have some real rigor in your cities and looking to tee things up and personalize it. And so just want to commend your work out there. And again, please reach out to us. We have office hours next week. Come to those if you have additional questions. And one more time, thanks. Appreciate you all attending today.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Jeannie.
Thank you all.
And thank you, Alyssa. And we look forward to seeing you in a week. I'll say happy Juneteenth. That's coming up for this Friday, I believe, for folks. And thank you for joining us again with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research office hours. And we will see you next week.